My name is Eliza Butler, and at 42 years old, as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, I was used to facing down the enemy. But I never imagined the most dangerous one would be my own husband, sitting across from me in this very courtroom. "I'll be taking half of everything, including your grandmother's estate," Caleb announced with a self-satisfied smirk, his voice echoing in the sterile chamber as if he were calling out winning lottery numbers. The confidence in his tone was a punch to my gut, but I forced myself to remain composed in the defendant's chair. But he had made one fatal, tactical error. Before I tell my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and get ready for a story of calculated betrayal and a reckoning delivered with military precision. The sound of Caleb's declaration hung in the air, a toxic vapor filling the space between us. Before I could fully process the audacity, his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, rose to his feet. He was a man who looked like he was born in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his voice smooth and practiced like a narrator for a luxury car commercial. He began his performance. He painted a masterpiece of deception. In Thorne's telling, Caleb wasn't just a husband. He was a martyr. A man who had bravely set aside his own American dream so that his wife, Lieutenant Colonel Butler, could serve her country. "My client spent countless sleepless nights," Thorne said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, gesturing toward Caleb. "Worrying, pacing the floor every time his wife was deployed in a conflict zone. He put his ambitions on hold, creating a stable, loving home for her to return to." I sat there, my hands resting calmly in my lap, but my mind was screaming. Sleepless nights? I remembered those nights all too well. They weren't spent pacing. They were spent at the Congressional Country Club, entertaining potential business partners at the bar. The scent of expensive whiskey and cigars clinging to him when he'd stumble home in the early morning. They were spent funding a lifestyle I didn't even have time to live, all documented on the credit card statements I paid without question. The lies were so brazen, so meticulously crafted, they were almost impressive in their shamelessness. And Caleb. Caleb just sat there, nodding gravely at Thorne's words. He tilted his head slightly, a perfect portrait of noble sacrifice. He was playing the part of a lifetime, and for a moment, I could see the jury buying it. I allowed my eyes to drift from the lawyer to my husband, the architect of my public humiliation. It wasn't just the smug satisfaction radiating from him that cut me to the bone. It was something far worse. He looked bored. As if the systematic destruction of my life, the life he had supposedly cherished, was nothing more than a tedious administrative task, a trip to the DMV. As Thorne droned on about Caleb's profound emotional contributions, Caleb discreetly, almost imperceptibly, glanced down at the Rolex on his wrist, my last birthday gift to him. A flash of polished gold against a starched white cuff. His eyes, the same blue eyes that had once looked at me with what I believed was adoration, swept over me now with a chilling vacancy. There was no flicker of shared history, no ghost of affection, not even a trace of remorse. There was only the cold, hard glint of a predator assessing its prize. In that moment, he wasn't the man I had married. I wasn't even sure that man had ever truly existed. He was a stranger, a hostile entity executing a legal heist. And that indifference, that profound lack of any human connection to the 5 years we had shared, hurt more than the greed. The greed I could understand as a base, simple motive. But his apathy told me that every memory, every promise, every moment I'd held sacred was utterly worthless to him beyond its monetary value. I felt the familiar tremor start deep in my chest, a vibration of pure, unadulterated rage. It wanted to travel up my throat and out of my mouth in a scream. It wanted to shake my hands. But 20 years in the Army teaches you a few things. It teaches you that your body is a machine and you are its operator. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. I focused on the rhythm, a silent cadence drilled into me from years of training for high-stress situations. While Marcus Thorne spun his fiction, I went into mission mode. I turned the fury into fuel, a cold, clean energy that sharpened my focus. I let the pain recede and allowed the intelligence officer to take over. I observed. The jury. A mix of tired, attentive, and skeptical faces. A woman in the front row, maybe in her late 50s, frowned slightly at Thorne's more dramatic pronouncements. Good, I thought. A potential ally. I analyzed the judge, the Honorable Judge Hawthorne, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor. Her face was an impassive mask, but her eyes missed nothing. I was gathering intel, assessing the battlefield. My thigh tensed, and I became aware of the weight of the leather briefcase resting on my lap. It felt dense, heavy like a piece of mission-critical equipment. It was a simple, unassuming object. But what it held within was anything but. It wasn't just a stack of legal papers. It was truth. It was justice. It was a precision-guided munition, calibrated and waiting for the right moment to detonate. The court will take a 15-minute recess, Judge Hawthorne announced, her voice cutting cleanly through Thorne's rhetoric. The rustle of clothing and the scraping of chairs filled the room as everyone stood. In that brief moment of shifting bodies, Caleb's eyes found mine across the courtroom. And then he gave me the smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a triumphant one. It was the condescending, all-knowing smirk of a card shark who is absolutely certain he's holding the winning hand, looking at a fool he's about to fleece. He thought he had me. Pinned down, outmaneuvered, defeated by his superior strategy. But he didn't know. He couldn't possibly know that this very smile was his most critical error. That smile was the thing that had jolted me awake from the 5-year-long dream I had been living in. That smile was the signal that had activated every dormant instinct, every analytical skill I possessed as an intelligence officer. And as I looked at that smug curve of his lips right now, my mind was no longer in the courtroom. It was flashing back to another smile, identical in its arrogance, on that fateful day 5 years ago. The day he thought he had played me so perfectly. That smile. It wasn't just the expression I was seeing now under the sterile fluorescent lights of the Fairfax County Courthouse. It was a ghost. That smirk pulled me through time, yanking me out of the tense, air-conditioned courtroom and dropping me back 5 years into the warmth of a memory I'd once cherished, but now understood as the beginning of the end. It started with a phone call from my best friend and lawyer, Eleanor Hayes. "Eliza, he's too perfect," Eleanor had said, her voice sharp and devoid of pleasantries over the phone line. It was her, attorney voice, the one that left no room for debate. And in my line of work, too perfect is a red flag the size of Texas. I had laughed, a genuine, happy sound. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage at the Pentagon, the engine off, basking in the glow of my new engagement. "Eleanor, you've been handling bitter divorces for too long. You're cynical," I chided her gently. "You don't see the way he looks at me." There was a weary sigh on the other end of the line. "I may not see how he looks at you, Eliza, but I do see his credit report, and it tells a story of ambition without the income to back it up. Get a prenuptial agreement. Consider it a direct order from your friend." The suggestion felt like a betrayal. A cold legal document seemed like an insult to the beautiful, trusting thing Caleb and I were building. But Eleanor was my oldest friend. So, reluctantly, just to appease her, I agreed. I hung up the phone feeling a knot of guilt in my stomach, like I was already planning for a failure that felt impossible. That evening, I decided to bring it up. Our apartment in Arlington had a stunning view of the Potomac River, the lights of the monuments twinkling in the distance. It was a peaceful scene, and I wanted to handle this with the utmost care. I waited until after dinner, when we were relaxing on the sofa with glasses of wine. I chose my words carefully, framing it as a formality, a piece of paperwork for Eleanor's peace of mind. His reaction was worse than anger. Anger I could have debated, reasoned with. Instead, he gave me silence. He simply put his wineglass down on the coffee table and looked at me. His brilliant blue eyes, which usually held such warmth, filled with a deep, theatrical pain. It was a masterful performance of a heartbreaking in real time. "I see," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're an officer, Eliza. You have to protect your assets. I get it." He stood up and walked towards the sliding glass door to the balcony, his back to me. "But I hoped that with me, you could just be Eliza." He paused, his hand on the door. "I just wonder, if you can't trust me with this, How are we supposed to build a life together? And just like that, he had flipped the script. The master manipulator at work. In the space of 30 seconds, I was no longer the responsible adult taking a prudent step. I was the cold, untrusting woman wounding the man who adored her. Guilt, hot and heavy, washed over me. I followed him out onto the balcony, the cool night air feeling sharp against my skin. "It's not that I don't trust you, Caleb," I said quickly, my voice pleading. "It's just complicated. It's for Eleanor." He turned, and in the soft glow from the living room, I could see the sheen of what looked like unshed tears in his eyes. He pulled me into an embrace, his arms wrapping around me tightly. "I know, my love. I'm sorry," he murmured into my hair. "I'm just being sensitive. I love you so much, and the thought of you having to be on guard with me, it just hurts." He held me for a long moment, letting the guilt really sink in. Then, he delivered the final, perfect blow. "Okay," he said, pulling back to look me in the eyes. "We'll do it. Whatever it takes to make you feel safe. Because your security, your peace of mind, is more important to me than any piece of paper." He agreed. But he did it in a way that made me feel like a monster. He painted his concession as an act of profound, selfless love, a sacrifice he was making for my cold-hearted pragmatism. I walked away from that conversation feeling like I owed him an apology. Like I now had to spend the rest of our lives proving that I did, in fact, trust him completely. The signing day at Eleanor's office in Old Town Alexandria was a study in contrasts. The office was formal, smelling of old books and ambition. Caleb arrived looking relaxed and handsome, carrying a bouquet of a dozen red roses for me, as if we were celebrating an anniversary. He greeted Eleanor with a charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When Eleanor slid the thick document across the polished mahogany table, he didn't even flinch. He picked up the expensive fountain pen, scrawled his signature on the final page without so much as glancing at the clauses within, and pushed it back. It was a grand gesture of indifference, meant to show how little such worldly matters meant to him when it came to our love. As he handed the pen back to Eleanor, he caught my eye, and he smiled. It was the exact same smile I was seeing in the courtroom today. At the time, 5 years ago, my love-addled brain interpreted it as a smile of reassurance, of boundless generosity. I saw it as him saying, "See? This paper means nothing to me, only you do." But now, with the painful clarity of hindsight, I know exactly what it was. It was the triumphant smirk of a predator who had just watched its prey willingly walk into the trap and lock the door from the inside. He hadn't read the agreement because the words on the page were irrelevant to him. His strategy wasn't based on legal loopholes. It was based on a weapon he believed was far more powerful: the love and the guilt he had so expertly cultivated in me. That night, I took the signed, notarized document home. I walked into my small home office, knelt down, and spun the combination dial on my heavy, fireproof safe. The thick steel door swung open with a satisfying clunk. I placed the document inside, alongside my service medals and my grandmother's jewelry. I closed the door, spun the dial, and felt a wave of relief. It was done. I had protected myself, and I had kept my future husband. I felt secure. I felt safe. I had no idea that I had just locked away the evidence of a war that had already begun. The sense of security I felt after locking away that document was, in hindsight, a tragic illusion. The real catalyst, the event that truly set Caleb's plan in motion, came 3 years later. It began with a loss. My grandmother, Rose, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 95. She was the last of her generation, a woman forged in the Great Depression who taught me the value of independence, resilience, and a well-managed savings account. The grief was immense, but flying back from her funeral in California, I also felt the weight of a new responsibility. She had left her entire estate to me, the result of a lifetime of hard work and prudent living. It wasn't just money, it was her legacy. Caleb met me at the arrivals gate at Dulles International Airport. He held me tightly, letting me cry into his shoulder, whispering all the right things. "I'm here for you, baby. We'll get through this together." He was my rock, and I leaned on him, grateful for his strength. But later, at the lawyer's office, when the final number was read aloud, nearly $3 million plus the properties, I saw something shift behind his eyes. It was a flicker, instantaneous and subtle. But I saw it. It wasn't the look of relief for our shared future. It was the sharp, hungry glint of a jackpot winner. It was pure, unadulterated greed. A few weeks later, Caleb sat me down on the sofa, taking both of my hands in his. He had that serious, earnest look on his face, the one he used for important conversations. "I've been thinking," he began. "I'm quitting my job." He rushed on before I could react. "I want to be here to support you, fully. You've sacrificed so much for this country, Eliza. It's time someone took care of the home front. Let me handle the finances, manage this new portfolio, so you can just focus on your career without any distractions." It sounded so noble, so selfless. A modern husband stepping up so his high-powered wife could thrive. But his version of management began almost immediately. His reliable Honda Accord was traded in for a gleaming silver Porsche 911. "It's an investment, honey," he explained smoothly when I raised an eyebrow. "These classic models only appreciate in value." Next came the initiation fee for a full membership at the Congressional Country Club, a place where he assured me he would be building relationships for our future. His sensible work slacks were replaced by a wardrobe of tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. Our life, once a comfortable rhythm of duty and quiet weekends, accelerated into a dizzying blur of consumption. The minimalist decor of our apartment was soon cluttered with abstract art sculptures he'd bought at upscale galleries, pieces that cost more than my car. Our weekends, which used to be spent hiking the quiet trails of Shenandoah National Park, were now first-class flights to Napa Valley for investment-grade wine-tasting tours. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in my stomach. This wasn't me. This wasn't Rose's legacy. When I tried to voice my concerns, to suggest we slow down, he would deploy his most effective weapon: gentle condescension. "Eliza, my love, you're used to a scarcity mindset from the military. It's not your fault," he'd say, stroking my hair. "You have to learn to think like the wealthy do, to live like we deserve. Just trust me." He twisted my discipline into a flaw, my prudence into an inability to enjoy life. And I, still wanting to believe in the man I married, let him. He was spending my grandmother's money faster than I could track it, and with every purchase, a small piece of my trust eroded. He also began to leverage my identity. At DC social events and charity galas, he would introduce himself with practiced charm. "Caleb Vance," he'd say, shaking a hand. "My wife is Lieutenant Colonel Butler." He'd let my rank hang in the air, a badge of honor he wore as his own. Then he would casually mention our family's venture capital investments, painting himself as the quiet financial genius behind the decorated officer. He wasn't just spending my money. He was stealing my reputation, my years of service, and wearing it like a costume. The final, shattering illusion came crashing down during the holidays. We were at the annual Christmas party at the Fort Myer Officers Club. The air was festive, filled with the sounds of a string quartet and the sight of dress uniforms and elegant gowns. I was chatting with a fellow officer when I excused myself to get a drink. As I neared the bar, I overheard Caleb's voice, louder than the rest, holding court with a small group of defense contractors. "Oh, Eliza's career is admirable, of course," he said, swirling a glass of what looked like very expensive scotch. "Absolutely admirable. But let's be honest, it's my financial acumen that allows for our lifestyle." He chuckled, a self-important sound that grated on my nerves. One of the contractors, a man I knew slightly, asked, "So what is it you do, Caleb?" Caleb took a dramatic sip of his drink and laughed. "I manage the family portfolio. It's a full-time job, believe me." The blood drained from my face. It was one thing to do it in private, but to say it here, in my world, surrounded by my peers, it was the ultimate act of disrespect. That night, back in our apartment, I confronted him. I was calm, direct. I told him what I'd heard. I expected him to be embarrassed, to apologize. Instead, for the first time, the mask of the supportive husband didn't just slip, he ripped it off and threw it on the ground. His face twisted into a sneer I'd never seen before. Oh, come on, Eliza, don't be so naive, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Who's going to believe a grunt knows how to make real money? Your whole career is about following orders. I'm the one with the vision. He took a step closer, his eyes cold. I'm giving you a life of class, a life you could never have achieved on your own. You should be grateful. His words, "You just know how to follow orders," didn't just hang in the air of our apartment that night, they detonated. In that single contemptuous phrase, the man I had loved, the life I thought I was building, vanished completely. What was left in his place was not a husband, but a hostile. A target. Sleep was not an option that night. While Caleb snored softly in our bed, blissfully unaware of the switch he had just flipped, I sat in the silent darkness of my home office. The heartbreak that had been a dull, throbbing ache in my chest for months had transmuted into something else entirely. A cold, crystalline clarity. For 20 years, my entire professional life had been dedicated to identifying, analyzing, and neutralizing threats to national security. The methodology was as much a part of me as the blood in my veins. A quote from a general I deeply respected, a man who had led us through the fog of war in Fallujah, echoed in my mind. In the fog of war, trust your preparation, not your hope. I had been clinging to hope for far too long. Hope that I was wrong. Hope that there was a misunderstanding. Hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was time to trust my preparation. I opened my secure laptop, the quiet hum of the machine the only sound in the room. The mission was clear. The threat was domestic. The objective, to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy against me. I created a new encrypted file on my hard drive. I named it, simply, Operation Vance. The wife was gone. The commanding officer of this investigation was now in charge. My approach was systematic, just as it would be for any high-value target. Phase 1. Asset and Expenditure Analysis. I pulled up the statements for every credit card, every bank account, every investment portfolio he had touched. I built a spreadsheet, cross-referencing dates and expenses. A clear and damning picture emerged. It wasn't just frivolous spending, it was a campaign of financial deception. Tens of thousands of dollars funneled into expenses he'd passed off as client gifts or business travel. Charges from jewelry stores in Georgetown for items I'd never seen. Hotel bills from cities he was never supposed to have been in. Next, I moved to open source intelligence, OSINT. Caleb wasn't a trained operative. His digital footprint was clumsy. I started with his browser history on our shared desktop, the one he used for research. Wedged between searches for vintage Porsches and Swiss watches was a breadcrumb trail leading straight to his intentions. Search terms like Virginia inheritance law spouse, minimum marriage duration for alimony, VA, how to convert separate property to marital property. He had been researching his battlefield long before he ever revealed we were at war. And then I found the most sickening clue of all. He'd been an active member on a divorce law forum, asking thinly veiled hypothetical questions. I checked the dates of his posts. The earliest one was 6 months before my grandmother had even passed away. The plan had been in place all along. Her death wasn't the catalyst, it was just the payday. But I knew the real intelligence, the motherlode, would be on his personal laptop. A sleek MacBook he guarded like it was a state secret. That was the primary target. I had to wait for the perfect window of opportunity, a moment when his guard was down. It came that Saturday. He left early in his Porsche, dressed in crisp golf attire, heading off for a weekend tournament with his business associates. "Don't wait up, honey," he'd called out cheerfully. "Going to be a long day of networking." As soon as the sound of his engine faded, I went to work. I knew his password, my birthday. The irony was so cruel it was almost poetic. A part of me felt dirty, like a common burglar violating his privacy. But I silenced that voice with cold logic. This wasn't a violation, this was a warranted search. You don't apologize for reading the enemy's battle plans. I spent hours methodically sifting through his files, my training kicking in, looking for anomalies, for anything out of place. It was mostly what I expected. Photos, music, documents related to his fake business ventures. But then, buried deep within a folder labeled Old Projects, I found it. a single, innocuous-looking file named Future. It was encrypted. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. Caleb, in his supreme arrogance, saw himself as a mastermind. But in reality, he was an amateur. He'd used a second password for the encryption, but it was a simple one he thought was clever. The name of his first dog, a story he'd told me on one of our first dates. I typed it in. Bingo. Access granted. The folder opened and the air was sucked out of my lungs. It wasn't just a file. It was a meticulously organized dossier of his betrayal. There were hundreds of emails between him and his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, dating back nearly 2 years. They discussed the optimal timing for the divorce filing. They strategized on how to commingle my inheritance to make it look like marital property. There was even a detailed Excel spreadsheet. It listed all my known assets, my military pension, my savings, and a column next to it titled Caleb's projected share. He had a name for their plan. He called our 5-year marriage the investment phase. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the glow illuminating my face in the dim room. The pain was so sharp, so profound, it went beyond tears. It was a freezing sensation, a core of ice forming in my soul. Every doubt was erased, every hope was incinerated. All that remained was the cold, hard, undeniable truth. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady. I scrolled to Eleanor's number and pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm. "Eliza, everything okay?" I took a breath, my own voice coming out flat, devoid of emotion, like an officer making a field report. "Eleanor," I said, "we have a situation. It's time for a counteroffensive." My call to Eleanor had been the signal flare. The next morning, I was sitting in her office in Old Town Alexandria. With its brick-lined streets and historic charm, the city felt a world away from the cold, calculated reality of my situation. But inside Eleanor's office, there was no charm, only focus. It had become our war room. The tactical maps of my day job were replaced with financial flowcharts, and thick volumes of Virginia Commonwealth law spread across her mahogany desk. Eleanor, with her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that could dissect a lie from 100 yards, was my commanding general. I handed her a USB drive containing the copied contents of Caleb's Future folder. For nearly an hour, she reviewed the evidence in silence, her expression hardening with each email she read, each line of the spreadsheet she analyzed. Finally, she looked up at me, her gaze unwavering. "He made a rookie mistake, Eliza," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "He documented his entire conspiracy. This isn't just evidence of intent, this is a written confession." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. "So here's the operational plan. We are not going on the defensive. We are not reacting to his moves. We are going on the offensive. You will file first. We will seize control of the battlefield from the outset." The clarity of her strategy was a balm to my fractured soul. I had spent months feeling like a victim. Now I was a soldier with a mission. That evening, Eleanor took me to a quiet corner booth at the Majestic, a classic dimly lit restaurant just a few blocks from her office. Over plates of steak and glasses of Cabernet, she looked at me, her lawyerly demeanor softening into that of a friend. "Eliza," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You survived Fallujah. You will survive this." She took a sip of her wine. "The only difference is that this time, the enemy was sleeping in your bed. Treat him as such, a hostile target to be neutralized. It's just a mission." Her words were exactly what I needed. They weren't sentimental. They were practical, tactical, and true. They reinforced my resolve. In the weeks that followed, I lived a compartmentalized life. By day, I was Lieutenant Colonel Butler, commanding my intelligence unit at Fort Belvoir with precision and authority. I briefed generals, managed personnel, and made critical decisions. I was in control. At night, I would return to my silent apartment and become the plaintiff in the case of Butler versus Vance. Under Eleanor's guidance, I began to systematically fortify my financial lines. We moved every cent of my inheritance into new, separate accounts under a trust that was legally untouchable. not a single dollar would be left exposed to a claim of being commingled. I became an archivist of my own life, gathering and documenting every receipt, every credit card statement, every reservation that proved Caleb's extravagant spending and his lies. Each piece of paper was a round of ammunition. Every digital file was another layer of armor. I worked mechanically, methodically, pushing all emotion aside. This was a task, and I would execute it flawlessly. The day I went to Eleanor's office to sign the divorce petition, a cold rain was falling over Alexandria. Despite all the evidence, despite knowing the depth of his betrayal, it was still a moment of profound pain. As I held the pen over the signature line, my hand, a hand that had held steady through far more dangerous situations, trembled slightly. This signature wasn't just ending a marriage. It was the official timestamp on the death of a dream, even a dream built on a foundation of lies. Eleanor must have seen it. She placed her warm hand over mine. "It's okay," she said softly. "Sometimes to rebuild, you have to accept burning it all down first." I took a deep, steadying breath. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. Eliza Butler. Not Mrs. Vance. In that moment, a wave of deep sadness washed over me, but it was followed by something unexpected, a clean, quiet sense of liberation. The war had officially begun. We planned the first strike with tactical precision. Caleb's greatest weakness was his ego, his desperate need for social validation. So, we targeted him there. A process server, a tall, imposing-looking man, delivered the divorce papers to Caleb in the grand, wood-paneled lobby of the Congressional Country Club. On a Saturday afternoon, right in front of the very friends and business partners he was trying so desperately to impress. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but Eleanor got a full after-action report from the server. She relayed it to me with grim satisfaction. Caleb's smug, confident expression had reportedly dissolved in stages, first to pure shock, then to panicked confusion, and finally, to a deep, crimson rage as he realized what the papers were. He had been outmaneuvered. He had been publicly humiliated. He, who thought he was the puppet master, had just had his own strings cut in the most dramatic way possible. He had been stripped of his primary weapon, the element of surprise. He thought he was in control of the game, never realizing the board had already been flipped. That night, my phone began to buzz incessantly, a relentless barrage of calls and text messages from him. I glanced at the screen. The messages were a torrent of fury, threats, and feigned disbelief. "How could you do this to me?" "To US," one of them read. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't reply to a single text. I simply turned the phone to silent. Silence is a powerful weapon. Let him wonder, let him rage, let him fear what was coming next. He had made a fatal tactical error. He had awakened the soldier in me. And now, he was about to face the consequences. My silence was a countdown, a clock ticking toward an explosion I knew was inevitable. After days of ignoring his furious calls and texts, the pressure was building. Caleb was not a man who could tolerate being ignored or losing control. His entire persona was built on being the one pulling the strings. I just didn't know when or where the storm would finally make landfall. It happened on a Tuesday, at the end of a long, grueling day. As I walked across the sprawling asphalt of the Fort Belvoir parking lot, my mind was already shifting from threat assessments to dinner plans. The air was thick with the humid Virginia evening. Then, a familiar sound cut through the quiet hum of the bass, the aggressive roar of a Porsche engine. His silver 911 screeched into the space beside my sensible sedan, cutting me off and blocking me in. He practically fell out of the driver's seat. This was not the polished charmer I had married. His immaculate appearance was gone. His expensive silk tie was loosened, his hair a mess as if he'd been running his hands through it in frustration. And his eyes held a wild, desperate fury I had never seen before. They were bloodshot and feral. The faint but distinct smell of expensive whiskey hung around him, a cologne of desperation. The carefully constructed mask of the charming, supportive husband had been completely incinerated, leaving only the raw, ugly face of a cornered animal. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice a low, gravelly snarl. He stormed over and got right in my face, jabbing a finger toward me, his hand trembling with rage. How dare you humiliate me like that? Who in the hell do you think you are? For a fleeting moment, I saw a flash of the old me, the woman who would have flinched, who would have instinctively tried to de-escalate, to soothe his wounded pride. That woman was dead and buried. She died in my home office, staring at a spreadsheet that quantified her husband's betrayal. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even blink. My voice when it came was as cold and sharp as ice. Who am I? I repeated, my tone dangerously quiet. I'm the person who paid for the car you're driving, Caleb. I'm the person who pays for the apartment you live in and the ridiculously expensive suit you're wearing right now. I am the woman you spent the last 5 years of your life planning to defraud. His face went slack with shock for a single, deeply satisfying second. The sheer audacity of my response struck him dumb. He clearly expected tears, apologies, or at the very least, fear. He did not expect the unvarnished truth, but the shock was quickly swallowed by a wave of indignant rage. You spied on me, he shouted, his voice cracking, drawing the attention of a couple of soldiers walking nearby. You went through my private things? That's sick, Eliza. That's pathological. He was trying to pivot, to flip the script one last time, to paint me as the villain. But the gaslighting had lost its power. I no longer felt an ounce of guilt. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. For the first time in months, I looked directly into his eyes, and there was no fear, only a cold, burning fire. You call uncovering a conspiracy against me sick? I shot back, each word a bullet finding its mark. You called our entire marriage an investment phase, and you have the audacity to stand here, on a military base, and talk to me about privacy? His eyes widened in genuine panic. He hadn't known I'd seen those specific words. It was the look of a spy whose code had just been broken. You made a mistake, Caleb. A critical one, I continued, my voice low and steady, dropping into the register of a commander addressing a subordinate who had failed spectacularly. You thought my loneliness made me weak. You thought my dedication to my career made me naive. But you forgot who I am. I took another step forward. He instinctively took one back, a subtle but definite retreat. I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I am a soldier. And we do not back down when we are fighting for what is ours. The confrontation couldn't end here, in public. This needed a final, definitive conclusion. I walked past him toward our apartment, the silence thick with unspoken threats. He followed, fumbling with his keys, still reeling from the shift in power. As we entered the apartment, his rage, fueled by impotence and alcohol, needed a physical target. His wild eyes scanned the room, a room filled with things bought with my grandmother's money. He saw one of the abstract sculptures he'd been so proud of, a twisted piece of metal that had cost a fortune. With a guttural roar, a sound of pure animal frustration, he grabbed it and hurled it against the wall. It hit with a sickening crash, gouging the plaster before clattering to the hardwood floor, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "This was mine!" he screamed, his face purple with rage, veins bulging in his neck. "I invested 5 years of my life in you. I earned this." That was the moment. The final piece of the illusion shattered into a million pieces. He didn't see me, our life, or our love. He only saw a balance sheet where his expected profits had just been wiped out. He saw an investment that had failed. Caleb stood there, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He was shocked by my lack of reaction, by the cold, unwavering resolve in my eyes. He saw he had nothing left. No charm, no threats, no leverage. His bravado crumbled into pathetic desperation. "You'll regret this, Eliza," he stammered, his voice losing its force. "I will destroy you in court." It was the last, desperate threat of a defeated man. He turned, practically ran out the door. And a moment later, I heard the squeal of the Porsche's tires as he sped away into the night. I stood there alone in the sudden, ringing silence, my heart pounding in my chest. But it wasn't the frantic beat of fear. It was the powerful, rhythmic drum of adrenaline, of liberation. The truth was out. I had faced my enemy. The breaking point had been reached, and the vow of silence was broken forever. If you have ever had a moment where you finally found your voice and stood your ground, hit that like button to stand with me. And in the comments, just type, "I am a soldier," to show that you understand what it means to fight for yourself. Now, there was only one battlefield left to conquer: the courtroom. The aftermath of our confrontation left a ringing silence. Caleb's threat, "I will destroy you in court," was not the desperate rambling of an angry man. It was a declaration of war. And in war, the side with the best preparation wins. A week before the court date, the first enemy volley arrived. It was an email from Marcus Thorne to Eleanor, with me copied. A settlement offer. He wrote that his client, Caleb, wished to avoid prolonging this painful ordeal and was willing to accept a modest sum of $500,000 to start his life over. The email was a masterclass in veiled threats, slickly packaged in the language of false concern. Thorne went on to imply that a public, contested divorce could be detrimental to the career of a high-ranking officer and might even touch upon matters of national security, given my position. It was a cheap, transparent attempt at intimidation, a final, desperate psychological operation. I forwarded the email to Eleanor with a single question: "Your thoughts?" Her reply came back in minutes. "My thoughts are they're terrified. They're probing for weakness, hoping you'll break ranks to protect your career. They just revealed their hand, Eliza. They think your reputation is your weak point." I felt a surge of cold resolve. He was still underestimating me. He thought the uniform was just a job, not the very core of my identity. Eleanor's follow-up email, sent directly to Marcus Thorne, contained only 3 words: "See you in court." The final days before the trial were intense. Eleanor's office in Old Town Alexandria transformed from a legal practice into a full-blown mock courtroom. She was relentless. She became Judge Hawthorne, stern and impartial. A young, sharp-witted associate from her firm was cast in the role of Marcus Thorne, and his job was to tear me apart on the stand. They drilled me for hours, attacking me from every conceivable angle. The mock cross-examination was brutal. "Lieutenant Colonel Butler," the young lawyer began, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Isn't it true that you used your position of power and your extensive experience in intelligence to coerce Mr. Vance into signing a document he couldn't possibly understand?" "No, that is not true," I answered, keeping my voice level. "Mr. Vance is an educated adult who entered into the agreement willingly." Willingly? Or was he so blinded by love for a powerful, intimidating woman that he would have signed anything? "That's a question you'll have to ask him," I replied coolly. Eleanor, as the judge, would interrupt, her voice sharp. "Answer the question, Colonel. Yes or no?" They hammered me on my intentions. "Did you not conceal your true intent when demanding a prenuptial agreement, essentially planning for the marriage's failure before it even began?" My intent was to protect assets I had acquired over 15 years of military service and to honor my grandmother's legacy. It is a standard, prudent financial practice. It was an exhausting, mentally draining process. They forced me to confront the ugliest possible interpretations of my actions, to strip all emotion from my answers until they were as sharp and unbreakable as steel. We left no flank exposed, no vulnerability unaddressed. While the psychological preparation was underway, the physical evidence was being marshaled into our ultimate weapon. Eleanor had a large black document box, the kind used for major litigation. We organized our exhibits with military precision. Exhibit A, the original signed prenuptial agreement. Caleb's signature, a flamboyant, arrogant scrawl, was right there on the final page. Our silver bullet. Exhibit B, a detailed, itemized list of Caleb's personal debts, compiled from credit card statements and loan applications. The Porsche, the country club membership, the designer clothes, it all added up to just over $95,000 of his own personal liability. Exhibit C, the printed emails, all of them. The entire 2-year correspondence between Caleb and Marcus Thorne, plotting, strategizing, and referring to my life's work as their payday. And finally, Exhibit D, the report from a forensic accountant Eleanor had hired. It was a dry clinical document, but its conclusion was devastating. It certified that not a single cent from my inheritance trust had ever been commingled with any joint marital account. The financial firewall was absolute and provable. Each document was a layer of armor. Each page was a round of ammunition. Eleanor closed the lid of the box and gave it a soft, confident pat. "This isn't going to be a trial, Eliza," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "This is going to be a demonstration. All we have to do is present the facts." That night, sleep was impossible. The anxiety was a low hum beneath my skin, the natural tension of a soldier before a major operation. I found myself drawn to a book on my nightstand, a well-worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher emperor admired by so many military leaders. I opened it to a marked page, and a single quote seemed to lift off the page. "The obstacle in the path becomes the path." The trial wasn't an obstacle to my freedom. It was the only path to it. I got out of bed and walked to my closet. I opened the doors and just stood there for a long time, looking. Hanging there, perfectly pressed and waiting, was my Army service uniform, the dress uniform often called Class A's. 20 years of my life were represented in that single garment. The decorations on the chest, the Bronze Star, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. They weren't just ribbons. They were testaments to oaths kept, to sacrifices made, to times when I had put the mission before myself. Tonight, the mission was myself. My fingers traced the embroidered American flag on the right sleeve. I had fought for the values it represented: honor, truth, justice. It had been with me in Baghdad and Bagram, a constant reminder of what I served. Tomorrow, I would not walk into that courtroom as a scorned wife or a victim. I would walk in as Lieutenant Colonel Eliza Butler. I would not be alone. I would carry the weight of this uniform, the honor of a soldier, and the unbreakable heart of a woman who was finally, completely, ready for the final battle. The air in the courtroom was thick with manufactured sympathy. Marcus Thorne had just concluded his closing argument with the flair of a seasoned stage actor. He painted a picture of Caleb as a tragic, devoted husband, a man who had put his own ambitions on hold only to be cast aside, now asking for nothing more than fairness. It was a compelling performance. Caleb, for his part, played the role of the humble, heartbroken victim to perfection. His head slightly bowed, a look of profound sadness etched on his face. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my lap, my posture straight. I felt the weight of the jury's eyes on me, some filled with pity for Caleb, others with cold judgment for me. My uniform, which had felt like armor the night before, now felt like a target. Judge Hawthorne, a woman whose expression seemed permanently carved from granite, turned her gaze from Caleb to our table. Her voice was devoid of emotion. "Lieutenant Colonel Butler, does the defense have a response?" This was it. The moment the entire operation had been leading up to. Eleanor rose slowly, her movements deliberate and confident. She stood at the lectern, a picture of calm authority. "Yes, Your Honor, we do have a response," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the heavy silence. "In fact, we have a single document, signed by both parties 5 years ago, that will resolve this entire matter immediately." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Thorne shot a confused glance at Caleb. Eleanor retrieved 3 copies of a document from her briefcase. Without another word, she walked over and placed 1 copy on the judge's bench, handed the second to a stunned Marcus Thorne, and placed the third directly in front of Caleb. The effect was instantaneous. It was like a grenade had been silently detonated in the center of the room. The ambient noise ceased. I watched Caleb, every ounce of color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. He stared down at the paper as if it were a venomous snake, coiled and ready to strike. Thorne, fumbling slightly, began flipping through the pages. I could see the precise moment his professional confusion morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted from the pages to Caleb, his face a storm of betrayal and fury. He leaned over and whispered something viciously in Caleb's ear. It was clear this was the first he'd ever heard of it. Caleb's supreme arrogance, his belief that he could charm his way through anything, had just turned his own high-priced lawyer into a fool. Thorne straightened up, His composure shattered and made a feeble attempt to regain control. "Your Honor," he stammered, "my client was—" He was misled. He didn't understand what he was signing. Judge Hawthorne looked up from the agreement, her eyes glinting with an icy disdain that could freeze fire. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "is your client a literate, college-educated adult?" "Well, yes, but—" "Does he suffer from any cognitive impairment that would prevent him from understanding a contract?" "No, Your Honor." "Was there a weapon held to his head at the time of the signing?" Thorne's silence was the only answer required. The trap had snapped shut. Then, the judge did something I will never forget. She adjusted her glasses, looked out over the courtroom, and began to read aloud, her voice ringing with the clarity of a death knell. Article 3. Any and all inheritances, gifts, or bequests received by either party during the marriage shall remain the sole and separate property of the receiving party. A collective gasp went through the room. Article 4. All military retirement benefits, pensions, and disability pay earned by Lieutenant Colonel Butler are designated as her sole and separate property. Article 5. Both parties hereby waive any and all rights to claim spousal support or alimony from the other in the event of a divorce. Each clause was a hammer blow, systematically demolishing the foundation of Caleb's entire case. Each word nailed another plank onto the coffin of his greed. I glanced at Caleb. His mask of victimhood had crumbled, replaced by the raw, ugly face of a thwarted thief. He understood now. He wasn't getting a single dime. He lost it. "It's a trap," he screamed, leaping to his feet and pointing a trembling finger at me. "She trapped me. The whole thing was a setup." "Order!" The judge's gavel cracked down with the force of a rifle shot, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Mr. Vance, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed." But Eleanor wasn't finished. She remained standing, calm amidst the chaos. "Your Honor," she said, flipping to another page of the agreement in her hand. "If I may direct the court's attention to one final clause. Article 7. The judge nodded, her eyes still locked on Caleb. Article 7, Eleanor continued, her voice cutting and precise, stipulates that each party shall be solely responsible for any and all personal debts incurred in their name during the marriage. She paused for effect before delivering the kill shot. We have, as Exhibit B, certified statements for credit cards, auto loans, and country club fees under Mr. Vance's name, totaling $95,427. The courtroom erupted in a wave of shocked whispers. The jury members looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and disgust. Caleb stared at Eleanor, his mouth agape, his face a ghastly shade of white. He had walked into this room expecting millions. Now, he was not only leaving with absolutely nothing of mine, he was leaving shackled to a mountain of debt that was entirely his own. The fight went out of him completely. He swayed on his feet for a moment, then collapsed back into his chair like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His eyes were vacant, staring into the abyss of his own ruined scheme. The battle was over. The takedown was complete. And in the aftermath of the explosion, there was only a ringing, deafening silence. The judge's final words were lost in the ringing that filled my ears. The trial concluded not with a bang, but with a strange, hollow silence. Caleb remained frozen in his chair, a statue of ruin, his eyes vacant and staring at nothing. The war was over. The reporters, smelling blood in the water, immediately swarmed Eleanor, their microphones and cameras creating a chaotic scrum around her. But I had no interest in the victory lap. I just wanted air. I slipped out of the courtroom and into the relative quiet of the marble hallway. As I made my way towards the exit, I passed by Caleb's table. He was still sitting there, alone. Marcus Thorne, his lawyer, was already packing his briefcase, refusing to even look at his now toxic client. Caleb looked up as I approached, and the man I saw was a stranger. He looked 10 years older, the charm and arrogance completely stripped away, leaving behind something frail and pathetic. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. "Please, I have nothing." He'd tried every weapon in his arsenal, Charm, manipulation, intimidation, and now the last refuge of a defeated man, pity. But after everything, my heart had become a fortress. I was immune to his tactics. I stopped, not for him, but for me. There was one final piece of this mission left to complete. One final boundary to draw. You had everything, Caleb, I said, my voice quiet but firm, carrying in the still air. You had love, you had trust, you had a partner. You chose to trade all of that for the idea of money. This isn't something I did to you. This is what your own greed did to itself. He just stared, his eyes pleading. For the first time, I looked directly into them and I felt no fear, no lingering affection, only a profound and weary finality. You underestimated me, I continued. That was a fatal tactical error. Goodbye, Caleb. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing down the long hall. I did not look back. That door, the one that had led to 5 years of my life, was now closed, locked, and sealed forever. The news of Caleb's spectacular implosion spread through the tight-knit DC military and social circles like a wildfire. It became a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties and on the golf course he could no longer afford. The Caleb Vance story was a lesson in overplaying your hand. His collapse was as swift as it was total. As Eleanor had predicted, the community he had tried so hard to impress and exploit was the very instrument of his final undoing. The Congressional Country Club, citing a morals clause in his membership agreement, summarily expelled him. The so-called friends he had cultivated with my money now crossed the street to avoid him. Buried under a mountain of debt he had no way to pay, he was forced to sell the Porsche for a fraction of what he'd paid for it. Within months, he filed for bankruptcy and, in utter disgrace, left Virginia. Justice wasn't only served in a courtroom, it was served by the very society he had tried to swindle. That evening, Eleanor took me to dinner at the Majestic, a quiet, historic restaurant in Old Town Alexandria. I had expected to feel a sense of elation, a triumphant joy. But I didn't. As I sat across from her in the warm, dimly lit room, the only thing I felt was a bone-deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained me for months had finally drained away, leaving a vast, quiet emptiness in its place. The war was won, but the cost had been 5 years of my life and a faith in another person that I wasn't sure I'd ever fully recover. There were no boisterous celebrations, no loud toasts, just a shared, understanding silence. Eleanor raised her wine glass. To justice, she said simply. I raised mine, the crystal cool against my fingertips. To the truth, I replied. We drank, the quiet moment more meaningful than any victory party. Later, back in my apartment, the silence was different. It was heavier. I had won. I had defended my grandmother's legacy and my own honor. But now, in the quiet of my reclaimed home, the reality of it all settled in. I walked through the living room, a space that was finally, truly mine again. The garish, expensive sculptures Caleb had bought were gone, sold off to pay legal fees. The ridiculously oversized television was gone. The pretentious art books he'd left scattered on the coffee table were gone. It was just empty. I sat on the sofa, the quiet pressing in on me. I had my space back. I had my life back. But a part of me was gone too. The naive part that had believed in a perfect love. The part that had ignored the red flags because the hope was too intoxicating. I grieved for that version of myself. I grieved for the dream, even if it had been built on a foundation of lies. But as I sat there, watching the city lights twinkle through the window, another feeling began to surface, rising slowly through the exhaustion and the sadness. It was a sense of peace, a quiet, profound peace. This wasn't an ending. It was a clearing, a controlled burn to make way for new growth. I had faced the greatest threat to my life not on a foreign battlefield, but in my own home, and I had survived. I had won. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely safe. A year can change everything. The silence that had once felt so heavy in my empty apartment had gradually transformed into a quiet, generative peace. It was in that peace that I found my new mission. 1 year after the trial, I stood not in a courtroom, but in a modest but bright new office in Alexandria. The walls were painted a calm, hopeful shade of blue. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, and on the wall directly across from my desk, where I could see it every day, was a beautifully framed portrait of my grandmother, Rose. Her smile in the photograph was warm, her eyes full of the quiet wisdom I had cherished so much. I'd spent months after the divorce thinking about the inheritance she had left me. Caleb had seen it as a jackpot, a collection of assets to be liquidated and spent on fleeting luxuries. But that was never what it was. Rose's legacy wasn't in the dollar amount. It was in the values she had lived by: independence, resilience, and the quiet power of self-sufficiency. It was a legacy of strength, meant to build, not to be consumed. And I finally knew how to honor it. The gold-lettered sign on the office door read, "The Butler Rose Foundation, Financial Empowerment for Military Families." My personal war had become a public mission. The foundation, funded by a significant portion of my inheritance, offered free workshops and resources for service members and their spouses. We covered everything from basic financial planning and investment strategies to family law and asset protection. I brought Eleanor on as a board member, and she helped us build a network of trusted, low-cost attorneys, ready to help soldiers and their families draft the legal documents, like prenuptial agreements, that could protect their futures. I was determined to ensure that no other soldier, no other military spouse, would ever have to face a predator like Caleb unarmed. The greatest vulnerability he'd exploited in me was not my love, but my lack of financial vigilance in the face of it. I had turned my greatest weakness, my most painful lesson, into my most powerful purpose. The scar tissue from my battle had become armor for others. The full circle moment, the one that showed me how far I had come, happened a few months ago. I was leading a workshop at Fort Myer, in a large auditorium filled with young service members, many with their spouses sitting beside them. I had just finished sharing a sanitized version of my story, not as a tale of bitterness, but as a case study in the importance of financial preparedness. When I opened the floor for questions, a young woman in the back raised her hand. She was a captain, her uniform crisp, her posture perfect, but her eyes held a vulnerability I recognized instantly. "Lieutenant Colonel," she began, her voice clear but laced with a quiet uncertainty. "After everything you went through, how do you ever trust anyone again?" A hush fell over the room. It was the question I had asked myself 1,000 times in the dead of night. It was the question everyone in that room, in some way, was afraid of. All the financial planning and legal documents in the world couldn't answer this one fundamental human question. I took a breath and looked out at the sea of faces, and I gave them the only honest answer I had. "Trust isn't blindness," I said, my voice softer now, more personal. "That's not trust, that's a gamble. Real trust is built on a foundation of honesty, but it's protected by the walls of wisdom. You can and you should love someone with your whole heart, but you must also protect your future with a clear head." I paused, letting the words sink in. Discipline isn't just for the battlefield, it's for life. It's the discipline to ask the hard questions, to have the uncomfortable conversations, to put legal protections in place not because you expect failure, but because you respect the institution of marriage enough to fortify it against any threat, internal or external. I looked directly at the young captain. And true trust? It doesn't come from closing your eyes and hoping for the best. It comes from opening your eyes wide, seeing a person for exactly who they are, their strengths and their flaws, and making a conscious, informed choice to believe in them. You choose someone worthy of that belief. After the workshop, as I drove home, the sun was setting over the Potomac River, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The loneliness that had once been a constant companion was gone. My life was full of purpose, full of friends like Eleanor, and full of a quiet, unshakable peace that no amount of money could ever buy. Caleb had tried to take my fortune, but in the end, he gave me a priceless gift: freedom. The freedom from illusions, the freedom from fear, and the freedom to build a life on my own terms, founded on my own values. I had survived, I had won, and I had found my way. My story is proof that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and our hardest battles can pave the way for a life of purpose. It wasn't an easy path, but it was mine to walk. Thank you for walking it with me today. If you believe that every scar tells a story of survival and strength, please hit that like button. For more stories about resilience and finding justice, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, please share one word that describes what this story made you feel.